Thank you, Theo. Good morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure today to be introducing Dr. Jacob Schmidt-Madsen, whose work I became aware of 2 or 3 years ago, I think, when completed his doctoral thesis. And it's a rare confluence of subjects for us. I think people will be quite surprised to find out that we're hosting a talk on board games in pre-modern India. But yeah, the connections between that and the Center for Yoga Studies work are many and fascinating. Dr. Schmidt-Madsen is a postdoctoral researcher and acting director of the Center for the Study of Indian Science at the University of Copenhagen. And he works, as of course we're going to hear all about, within the field of historical game studies with special emphasis on traditional South Asian board games. He's written extensively on the games of Chaupar, Ludo, which I don't know about the rest of you, but I played a lot when I was a kid. And of course, Gyan Chaupar, known similar to Snakes and Ladders, which I think most of us probably played as well. And he's currently preparing a book on the history of games in South Asia. His PhD thesis was called The Game of Knowledge, Playing at Spiritual Liberation. So you can see where we're heading towards our connections with yoga, playing at spiritual liberation in 18th and 19th century Western India. And that too was from the University of Copenhagen under the supervision of Professor Kenneth Zisk, who I'm sure many of you will have heard of, who's written extensively on many Indian subjects, particularly medicine. And so today, over to you, Jacob, now to talk to us about snakes, ladders, and the subtle body, tracing the grid behind the game of knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Jim. I will now just share my screen. Oops. There you have it. Okay, and it seems to work. So yes, today we're going to talk about board games. So the history of board games in South Asia is long and varied. It reaches back almost 5,000 years to the Bronze Age Indus Valley civilization in the northwestern parts of the subcontinent. And it covers these several thousand years, and it covers also several thousand games in that period, both original games and variations of games. And several of these games, some of which Jim just mentioned, are known to us today still. Games like chess, Ludo, and Snakes and Ladders, all of which have Indian origins. So today, these games are often considered sort of purely abstract games. Often they're considered sort of innocent pastimes. But this was not always true of them. They were always placed as innocent pastimes, but they also had underlying meanings, which today has largely been forgotten. So often they were actually considered as kind of models of aspects of reality. So if we take a game like chess, for example, the earliest textual reference that we have to chess is from the Harsha Charita by Banabhatta in the 7th century, where we read that during the reign of King Harsha, the arrangement of the 4-limbed army only takes place on game boards, and battles between kings are only fought between clay figurines. So today we still have that association between chess and war. Chess is a game of war, but not really in the simulational sense that it had previously. Similarly, if we look at a game like Ludo or Chaupar, we find that it appears in several of especially the Bhakti poetry from the 15th century onwards, where it uses a metaphor for life. And here's an example from Mirabai, for example. The vast world and its fourfold frame is nothing but a Chaucer game. Deftly play the pawn of your soul, and you win the match, attain the goal. But if deceitfully you load the dice, with human birth you pay the price. Again, today, few people probably associate a game like Chaupar with the cosmos and as a metaphor of existence, but probably rather think of it as an innocent and perhaps even quite boring children's game. But today I'll not talk about chess and I'll not talk about Chaupar, but instead I'll be talking about Gyan Chaupar, or the game of knowledge. This is the game that is behind what we know today as Snakes and Ladders. So I'll start by talking briefly about sort of the origins and history of snakes and ladders. Then we'll go a little bit deeper into some of the early Gyan Chaupar boards on which snakes and ladders was based. And then we'll start looking at how they might possibly be connected to charts of the subtle body. And then finally, I'm going to say a few words about the living traditions of playing Gyan Chaupar today and how that may also relate back to really early practices of how Gyan Chaupar was originally used. And then finally, there'll be time for some questions. But let's start out with snakes and ladders that all of us know. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm sort of going to very briefly explain the rules of snakes and ladders. So this, for example, could be the game board. You start your pawn in the bottom left square, and then you move in a serpentine fashion up through the board to the finishing square at the top right. Now, if at any point in the game you land at the foot of a ladder, your pawn moves up to the top of the ladder. Conversely, if you land at the head of a snake, your pawn will move back to the tail of the snake. And then whoever reaches the finish square first wins the game. And that's basically all there is to it. Now, snakes and ladders first appears in the Western world, in Britain to be more exact, in London, in the late 19th century. We find it there as a didactic game, as a sort of moralistic game, a game for children to teach them sort of what's right and what's wrong. If we take and look at some of the squares on the board, for example, we can see here how vanity here illustrated as a girl brushing her hair in front of a mirror will, lead to a fall in status. You'll end up being a housemate, perhaps. Or the young girl who takes pity on the old blind man with the dog sitting at the steps. Well, she performs the virtue that sort of raise her up in society and make her a good member of society. And again, and a little bit of cause and effect on the right. The boy kicking and whipping the dog will end up being bitten by the dog. So we have that sense that there are some very sort of simple lessons to be learned from these games as they appear here in the late 19th century. Now, games that had this didactic mode and was imparting the difference between virtues and vices to people was something that had like a long history in the West and goes back several centuries. An example here might be another game from London from the early 19th century called Virtue Rewarded and Vice Punished. So that's kind of direct. And as you see here, again, we have sort of a spiral design with squares labeled after different vice and virtues, and you move inwards towards the center. And when you land on specific squares, specific things will happen. You'll have to look that up in a booklet next to the board. A few examples here might be that if you land, for example, on the square of hope, you'll have to forfeit your next turn. If you land on the square of virtue, which is the final square of the board in the center of the board, well, then you basically win whatever has been staked on the game. And again, if you land on the square of contention, well, you have to forfeit a counter, that is really pay a stake to each of the players and then move again. So this idea of virtues and vices is something that had existed for a long time in board games, and here, of course, interestingly, it's also combined with the idea that you're still staking something on the game. So it's really still a game of hazard, of staking things, even though it's a game about virtuous behavior. So the big difference between these games, what really happens in the late 19th century is suddenly that we get this visual imagery of the snakes and ladders. And that is really the real novelty. The novelty is not that it's a game about virtues and vices. The novelty is that we use snakes and ladders as connectors on the board. And these snakes and ladders, they derive from the Indian game of Gyan Chaupar, or the game of knowledge. Now, the game of knowledge is also, to an extent, a game about the consequences of good and bad action, papa and punya. But it's also, as we shall see, about a lot more. So we might say that it's often said that snakes and ladders is sort of an adaptation of the Indian game, but that's really only true in rather superficial sense. And that's what I hope to be able to show here during my talk. So let's first look at Gyan Chaupar a little more to find out what is it really? What is it that distinguishes that from Snakes and Ladders? So Gyan Chaupar is what the late philosopher John Hawkland would call an interpreted formal system. He used that terminology really to describe how artificial intelligence works in computers, but he used the analog of board games, more specifically abstract positional board games, where each position in the game is sort of a discrete position, and those positions are then associated with some kind of meaning, making it you capable to sort of interpret something from the game. So even though it's completely abstract and structured, you can still derive meaning from it. And the way that that works in the case of Gyan Chaupar is that you have a formal system which consists of a series of linked positions that you're going to follow from the bottom to the top. So you kind of progress along this unidirectional track. Then each player in the game has a single pawn, and this single pawn will move along the track. Then to move the pawns along the track, you throw cowrie shells. And this is sort of my own poor attempt at a graphic depiction of cowrie shells. It's these little seashells that are sort of binary when you use them as dice, in the sense that they can land either with the mouth upwards or the mouth downward. And then depending on the number of cowries that land with the mouth upwards, that's the number of spaces that you'll move ahead in the game. So here you have these randomizing agents that will drive your pawns forward along this track. Then additionally, you have these connections between squares, meaning that you can jump forward or you can fall backward along the track. Now, the game is still purely luck driven. You have only one pawn and you roll dice to determine how far it moves, and then you dust whatever the square says. I mean, normally you just stop, or if it's a ladder, you move up. If it's a snake, you move down. So you have absolutely no agency in the game. It's completely luck driven. And then what is slightly different in the game of Gyan Chaupar is that the winning position is not at the end of the track like we know it to be in Snakes and Ladders. No, it's in the middle of the top row of the board, meaning that you can overshoot the winning position. And as you can see, if you overshoot the winning position, there's a snake that'll take you back down into the game, and you'll have to sort of cycle around until you land in that winning position. Now, the main difference between Snakes and Ladders and Gyan Chaupar is the skinning of the game. And this, what you see now, is the formal system of Gyan Chaupar. However, the way it's interpreted, it works like this. All these linked positions, they now become spiritual stages on the way to liberation, which is the winning space at the top of the board. The pawns that you moved around, they become soul. So a single pawn become reflective of the player's soul in the game. The dice that you throw, they become representative of karmic fate. So it's not just a throw of, it's not about luck, it's really about fate. And these connectors, these apparently arbitrary connectors, then becomes loaded with a symbology of karma, positive and negative karma, leading to a rise or fall in your spiritual level in the world as you progress through the game. So as a whole, we might say that the game then becomes a simulation of a karmic journey of souls through the universe towards liberation. Now, Gyan Chaupar was mass-produced in late 19th century India. It was at the height of its popularity at that point. It was mass-produced in lithographs, and some of those lithographs also made it outside India and to the West. And this is probably the most likely point of inspiration for British game manufacturers to add Snakes and Ladders into their own games, because it fitted so well onto these didactic games that were already being produced. And it had the advantage that you didn't have to be able to read in order to play the games. You didn't have to, when you landed on a square earlier, there might be an inscription that said, well, go back 5 spaces, but you had to be able to read in order to do that. The Snakes and Ladders is much more immediate. It's just this visual imagery. So it's very nice for kids. I mean, you land on the top of the head of a snake, and you can just slide down its body down to its tail. So it works really well like that. And that was adopted by the British game manufacturers. And when it was being made as lithographs in late 19th century India, it had at that time already existed for more than a century in India in hand-painted versions or handmade charts. And it had existed in a variety of different religious environments. And the game was basically the same, what I outlined just before, but the skinning of the game, the theming of the game was different, corresponding to the different religious knowledge systems that it was representing. What differed was basically the layout of the board, the number of squares and exactly how they're put together, the placement of the snakes and ladders, and then, of course, most importantly, the inscriptions on the squares, because the inscription, of course, has to match whatever religious system you're portraying. So, for example, on a Vaishnava Bhakti board, the winning square will be Vaikunt, or the heaven of Vishnu, whereas on a Sufi board, the winning square will be the throne of Allah. So, let me just see here. Yeah. And the majority of these boards, they derive from Western India. Most of them were affiliated with Vaishnava or Jaina religion. And then they had outliers in different parts of Asia. They traveled in different directions. And the origins of the game and how it was transmitted around India is not clear in any way. But at least we can say that the largest concentration of these game boards are found in Western India, and most of them has a Vaishnava or Jaina orientation. And the very earliest boards that we find, they date from the late 18th century. And these, what you see here, is the earliest Vaishnava board that we know and the earliest Jaina board we know, both of them from the late 18th century. And I suspect, even though the game is often claimed to be ancient, thousands of years old or very old, or whatever, I suspect that it really isn't necessarily a lot older than the boards that you see here. We don't have any texts, we don't have any depictions of the game prior to this. Even in places where we'd expect the game to be mentioned, it doesn't appear. As I said earlier, in the Bhakti poetry, games are often used as a metaphor of life. And the game that is most commonly used is the game of Chaupar. And it would seem that if any of those poets were aware of Gyan Chaupar, that would be the much more obvious choice of a metaphor for life, because that's exactly what it is. But they always just refer to Chaupar. In fact, the only example we have of someone referencing Gyan Chaupar as a metaphor for life is Ramakrishna Paramahamsa in Bengal in the late 19th century, in the 1880s, where he's talking about this Bengali variant of the game called Golok Dham, which he uses as a metaphor for spiritual progress. But that's the earliest example we have of that. And beyond them, in my opinion, probably not being much older than these charts, maybe going back to the late 17th century, but I wouldn't think before. My research also suggests that it's the Vaishnava charts that are the earliest. And for the rest of my talk, I'll be using a sort of a critical reading of the Vaishnava Bhakti boards as my example. And this critical reading is based on several dozens of boards where I've been comparing the readings and all the squares and the placements of the snakes and ladders. And there's not a lot of variation between them, but there is some important variation, and sometimes variations that are distinctly trying to associate them with a specific sort of sectarian milieu. But the standard game looks something like this. And so what you have here is really a grid of 72 squares, and the squares are sequentially numbered corresponding to the direction of movement that you also know from traditional snakes and ladders, from 1 in the bottom left corner, and then in a serpentine fashion up the board to the top left corner, Tamagun number 72. And then all the squares are also inscribed, as you can see. And the inscriptions here fall into three main categories. One has to do with the organization of the universe, one has to do with human existence in the universe, and one has to do with the fundamental building blocks of the universe. So, for example, first, as to the organization of the universe, you'll see that here in the central column, we have the board separated into the different planes of existence, going from Bhulok up to Satyalok, the seven lokas, or the seven plane of existence, which are layering the boards, meaning that each row of the board become equivalent to a plane of existence. And then you have Vaikund, or the heaven of Vishnu, at the very top as the place of liberation. Then, as this, you might say that this is sort of the cosmography element of the boards. There's also sort of the lift element of the board, the human existence element of the board, which consists of numerous squares with positive and negative qualities, indicating positive and negative states and actions in the world. And some of those that I've highlighted here are pairs, like Subbuddhi Dhurbuddhi, Avidya Suvidya, Adham Sudham, Kusang Susang. These dualities that we know of. And then on the left, we also have the three sort of main paths to liberation: Kam Yoga, the way of action, or the discipline of action, and Gyan Yoga, or Gyan Marg, the way of knowledge, and then of course Bhakti, the way of devotion, which in this case will take you directly, Bhakti will lead you directly up to Vaikund, indicating that this is indeed a Vaishnava Bhakti chart, where Bhakti is the real shortcut to liberation. And finally, on the board, we have these different principles of creation that are mostly related to the Sankhya system of philosophy, the way of enumerating the different principles or building blocks of the universe. And in the top left corner, you'll see the three gunas, the three qualities that is inherent in all matter throughout the universe. And then in the top right, you have Prakriti, which is the primordial matter of the universe. And it is from the primordial matter that all other matter in the universe evolves. And Prakriti is one of the tattvas. There are 25 tattvas of fundamental principles, and they are consist of different groups. And we have two other groups enumerated here on the board. We have the Mahabhutas, or the gross elements that you see from square 51, 53, and 56 to 58. So that is like water, earth, wind, fire, and air, or ether. And we also have the tanmatras, or the subtle elements that you see a little bit further down: sound, taste, smell, touch, and form is missing here. But again, this is not sort of an attempt at a complete enumeration, but it shows the linking between the Sankhya system and the board by giving some elements, some hints. It's not a complete representation, but it gives you little bits and pieces to form a larger picture yourself. And interestingly here, if you notice, really the way the board is set up, the direction of evolution of the cosmos runs opposite to the direction of play. So you start with the gunas, and then you have Prakriti in the top right corner. And then if you move in a serpentine fashion down the board, you get this sense that the universe evolved from Prakriti, and then later you have the Mahabhutas and you have the Tanmatras. This again is not completely mirroring how the things work in Sankhya, but there's definitely a sense that the universe evolves top down in the opposite direction of play, meaning that the direction of play, starting in the bottom left with Janma, or birth, becomes an involution of the cosmos. You're moving in the opposite direction of the evolution of the cosmos towards liberation at the top. And this also may beginning already here to hint a little bit about some of the connotations that we find with these subtle body charts that we'll look on a little later. And it leaves a couple of squares left on the board, Agni and Durati, that doesn't really fit into the categories, but we can look at them again when we discuss the subtle body charts. Agni, for example, I believe is associated with digestive fire in the body, but we'll look at that a little later. And then finally, of course, the grid is overlaid with the snakes and ladders. And again, you can see here that the main ladder is the one reaching from Bhakti to Vaikunth. So overall, you can say the chart represents the totality of phenomenal existence. But that really only gives sort of a static view of the game board as an image. The interesting thing is really when we start to explore it ludically. What happens when you engage this chart as a game? And we need to have that dimension in order to really understand how it works and what experiences it affords its users. So we know that we don't know exactly how Gyan Chaupar was played. I mean, we know mechanically how it was played, and we also know that it was played in different modes. It could be played for educational purposes. It could be played sort of ritualistically on special occasions. It could be played as a mere pastime, or it could be played with for some kind of divinatory or self-exploratory purpose. And again, it's not exactly clear how that worked. But if we look at how the game plays, we might get a sense of how it could be used in this sort of divinatory, self-exploratory mode. So what happens when you play is that first you take your pawn, and as you only have one pawn, that really becomes the representative of you on the game board. And you place it here on the first square, Janma, or birth. So you kind of birth it into the game board. And immediately your attention is changed. You no longer look at the board in its totality, but you zoom in on a single square. So you're not looking at a map of the universe now. No, you're looking at the square in which you were born, and perhaps you're looking at the squares after following where you might end up when you start moving along the track in the game. Then you take up your cowrie shells and throw them, sort of handing yourself over to the divine fate. Whatever you throw will now determine how your pawn or your soul moves along this track of existence. And then you start moving in the game. So, for example, you'll throw a 5, and you'll move from birth to Mo to delusion. You were born into the universe. Now you're deluded. You have arrived in the universe. You're deluded. You're bewildered. You can't make sense of life. You throw a 4. You end up on top, and you start doing austerities. You start following some kind of spiritual discipline, which takes you directly by ladder to Svarklok, or heaven, the plane of heavenly existence. So things are going really well. Now you throw again, and you throw a 6, and you end up on adharm, or irreligiosity. Perhaps you lose sight of your religious duty because things were going so well since you entered heaven. So you sort of forget about your religious duty, and you slide back down to the delusion where you started. And then you throw again. This time, you don't end up in top practicing austerities and going back to heaven as you might have hoped for, but you end up in calm, passion or desire, and sensuous pleasures. And so when you look ahead on the track, your next throw, well, if you throw a 1, you'll be delivered right back up to heaven. But there's also a chance that you might throw a 3 or a 7, which will send you back down again. You throw, I should say, with 7 cowrie shells. So every throw will be a number between 0 and 7. So you'll look ahead and see, well, these are your options. And this, of course, will create a dramatic tension as you play the game. Now, what's interesting here is that what really happens is that as you play the game, you create a unique sequence of squares that you land on. And that becomes your personal experience of the board. And you connect them narratively. So you sort of create a spiritual biography for yourself as you move through the board. And you'll also notice certain recurring patterns. As we had here, for example, first he landed in square number 6 on Mo in delusion. And a little bit later, he was back there again. So what is this pattern? Is this something that I need to reflect on? So the game becomes very personal and very focused on where you are and what are the options ahead of you. And you sort of forget about the totality when you play the game. And in that sense, the game sort of stops becoming a map of human existence, but rather it becomes your own route through that existence. And this really is the power of games, this ability to use a simple interactive model to simulate a much larger, much more complex, much less formalized system. You simulate key aspects of a larger system using a smaller system. That's really in the essence what games does when used in a simulational mode. So now, the charts themselves, they're really mostly silent about how they should be understood. There are hints like the identification between a pawn and a soul is mentioned, the identification between Cories and and fate or karma is also mentioned, but largely they don't explain themselves, and we don't have any early text really explaining what the games are about. However, there are on the charts certain verses that are inscribed on them outside of the playing field that'll give us some hint as to how the game charts may have understood themselves. For example, there is a single verse occurring across a great number of the Jaina game boards, which reads something like this. These are my own translation from the Rajasthani Braj Bhasha, and there's some uncertainties in it. So if you see any obvious mistakes here, you're very welcome to let me know. So it reads, with great effort, one is freed from falling down the 9 great energy channels, the nadis, and roaming the 84 lakh birth situations, or yonis. What is the Chaupar of Shachundriya? It is the game of the nameless Brahman. If one plays this game, one extinguishes one's anger and does not roam around existence. One is joyful at heart. The game of knowledge, Jnana ki Baji, reduces sin, tears apart delusion, and increases knowledge. So here we get the sense that the snakes, the 9 great nadis, Maha, Nava, Nadi, are associated here with the snakes, and the nadis are, of course, the energy channels that runs in the subtle body. So here there's this connection that maybe the snake imagery is understood as a nadi imagery, and there's also here for the Jaina board the idea that each of the 84 squares on the board represents 1 lakh yonis, that is 1 lakh possible wombs or birth situations, places where you might be reborn in this world. There are 84 lakh, 8.4 million different births in the Jaina system of knowledge. Now, if we move to the Vaishnava boards, we find some similar verses on them. The Vaishnava boards are not as heavily inscribed as the Jaina boards, but we do sometimes find verses on them. For example, we have here a verse which talks about there being 9 energy channels, again, nadis, and then not 84 lakh yonis, but 72 kotas, squares, or as I say here, bodily cavities, in the sense of the enclosures in the subtle body where various divine principles exist, creating this relation between the microcosmos of the body and the macrocosmos of the universe. And a similar thing is said on another Vaishnava board. The game is called the Pastime of Knowledge, Gyan Vilas. One should play it with attention. It has 9 energy channels, nadis, and 72 kotas. Again, these squares on the board, but also the rooms in the body and in the subtle body. In it, everything is laid out, like the whole universe exists in this game. Now, nadis and kotas relate to this subtle body terminology, and we can, for example, find in the Nad body of literature references to this system. So, for example, from the Goragbani, we have a verse which describes the 9 nadis, again, the 9 energy channels, and the 72 kotas, or the 72 rooms in the body. And we have a another verse from another text which explains a little bit more about how these kotas are to be understood, from the Siddha Siddhanta Pattati, where we see that the 27 asterisms, the 12 houses of the zodiac, the 9 planets, the 9 lakh stars, the 15 tithis or lunar days, all dwell in their own 72,000 internal cavities, koshta in Sanskrit, of the interwoven nadis in the body. The translation is a little free, but I'm just adapting these translations from existing works. These are I haven't worked in detail on these texts like the people who translated them. But clearly here, we see that, again, the koshtas here, or the kotas, are enumerated as 72,000. Before we saw them enumerated as 72. Similarly, nadis are often enumerated as 72,000 nadis. But again, also talked about as 72. Whether you're at the 1,000 or not doesn't really matter. And clearly, the game board, the 72 squares of the game board, is then interpreted as being these 72 kotas in the body. So here's some relation to this subtle body terminology, and for the sake of completeness, as you already mentioned, that there's also a verse from the Sant poet Kabir that appears on several of the Jaina charts. And this verse from the Kabir Granthapali: he who walks between boundaries is a man, he who goes beyond them is a saint, but he who transcends the limited and the limitless, his greatness is unfathomable, in Vaudeville's translation. So again, this shows a connection to this world of Sant poetry. And all these traditions, these tantric, yogic, Sant traditions, they coexisted with the earliest board in the northwestern parts of India in the 18th century. And it seems quite clear that whoever made these games, or at least wrote the verses on them, were aware of these traditions. And there's, of course, also the interesting possibility that the game boards may, to some extent, have grown out of these traditions. So when we return to our game board, and we take with us sort of this new light that we just saw the charts in, more as being associated with the subtle body, we get sort of a different interpretation or a different reading of the chart. Before, we saw it very much as this macrocosmic event, this description of the totality of phenomenal reality in the universe. But this other interpretation shows a sort of a microcosmic counterpoint to that interpretation. So now we can look at all the squares. Here's the kotas. In the early medical literature, the kotas are really sort of the physical compartments in the physical body where the viscera lie. But in subtle body terminology, as we saw, it is these enclosures wherein these divine principles, asterism, all these different aspects of reality exist. And we also know this idea of kotas and enclosures from other mandalas and yantras. So it's not something that's unique to the game boards here. And the central column, we have these 7 lokas with Vaikunth on the top. Now, the 7 lokas, they're also mapped onto the subtle body along the central axis called the Merudanda, which is sort of the spine of the body, the axis of Meru that runs along the body, and they're mapped onto the body along the spine, similarly to the chakras. So we might also see the central column really as 7 chakras with liberation positioned on the top. Furthermore, incorporating the different nadis, we saw there was a association between the snakes and the nadis, and it seems likely that there's also an association then between the ladders and the nadis. And now the ladders really are not always drawn as ladders. Sometimes they're merely drawn as lines, and sometimes in Nepalese charts, for example, they're also drawn as snakes, but benign snakes, contrary to the negative snakes that take you down. There are also snakes that take you up. And then, of course, the presence of Ganga, Yamuna, and Saraswati in squares 47 to 49, then which appears somewhat odd, perhaps, on the chart as we have it. Well, they also, of course, doubles as names for the main 3 nadis, Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna. So what we end up with here is really an image of the subtle body. So the game board is no longer just a metaphor for the karmic journey through existence. It's also a metaphor for inner transformation and transcendence. And if we look at the way that you move up the chart, this serpentine fashion then becomes reminiscent of the Kundalini Shakti, the coiled serpent at the base of the lowermost chakra. And that is described as having a varying number of coils, but often the number 8 is used. That Kundalini is said to have 8 coils, which then might correspond to the 8 rows on the game board. And the whole act of playing the game might also be seen really as a way of raising the Kundalini Shakti and unlocking the different chakras and reaching liberation on the other side. Now, if we look at tantric and yogic charts of the subtle body as we know them, they're usually figurative, like the one that you see here, a Jaina example. And often they are also embellished with illustrations of the chakras, like you see here, or sometimes also other illustrations. And they're also often inscribed. So none of this is really new. And you can see a similar approach being taken, especially on the Jaina charts, which often uses the outline of a human figure around the board. And this human figure stands in the Kayotsaka pose of meditation, which is sort of a pose of meditation and where you stand upright, associated with Jainism. So that would be sort of the individualistic perspective of this man standing in a meditative pose, but at the same time, it also becomes the Loka Purusha, the cosmic man, within whose body the whole universe is set to exist in Jaina cosmology. So there seems to be also an awareness here on the Jaina charts very explicitly and visually of this correlation between microcosmos and macrocosmos. And yes, so even though that the charts that we normally see, they don't have these gridded squares in the center, we do have some very interesting examples, or at least one very interesting example from Bengal from the 18th century. Now, the chart that you see here first appeared in an article in the Calcutta Review in 1849, written by Babu Bibin Bihari Som. And yeah, I'll just read you the description of its whereabouts, of its origins. And Som writes, the late Babaganga Govinda Singha, who flourished in the late 18th century, a wealthy native residing in a village near Mushirabad, spent the greater part of his fortune in making researches into the Hindu Shastras. Not satisfied with the Pandits of his own village, he came to reside in Nadia, the famous seat of Sanskrit learning in Bengal. He invited several Pandits from the upper provinces, the original seat of Hinduism. It was by a set of these Pandits, known by the name of Daudus, that the originals of these 2 maps were drawn, according to the principles of the Tantras, expressly for the use of their employer. So what we see here is that this chart, and the other one that I'll show you in a minute, derive from Pandits that came from the upper provinces and known by the name of Daudus, which I take to be followers of Dadu Dayal, that is Dadu Pantis. And now the Dadu Pandis are, or Dadu Dayal is famous 16th century poet saint from Western India. And Monica Horstman, for example, has shown the close association between the Dadu Panti and the Nath traditions that we just saw a few quotes from earlier. And the Dadu Panta was widespread in Western India, at least from the 17th century onwards. And in the 18th century, it was received royal patronage in Jaipur, in the new city of Jaipur. And incidentally, the Jaipur region is the area where we find the highest concentration of Gyan Chaupar boards anywhere in India. All of this 72 square Vaishnava Bhakti variety. So it's interesting to find these correlations there. And whatever the exact connection here, between the presence of the Dadu Pant in Jaipur at the same time as we begin to see these early Gyan Chaupar boards, it's interesting to note the second chart here, which is another chart of the subtle body. You can see there are two different varieties here. The first one is sort of more traditional figurative one, whereas the second one has this grid placed on it. And as you can see, the central column here is embellished with symbols relating to the chakras and also symbols relating to cosmography, like the turtle and the snake at the bottom, forming the base upholding of the world as it exists. And there's also the presence of snakes down along the sides, 10 snakes in total, similar to the 10 snakes on the Vaishnava Gyan Chaupar boards. Now, the numbers that you see on the board, they're on the chart. We're not really there on the chart because this is a reproduction of the original chart. So here the numbers really correspond to a list of inscriptions. So each number stands for an inscription on the chart. And I'll now show you this inscription of the chart here in a diagrammatic form. And unfortunately, many of the terms were translated into English. So we don't really know the original wording, but I've reconstructed the original wording where I felt certain that that was what was intended, and then I've left a few squares in English where we weren't completely sure. But what we see here is we see a board that is similar in several regards to the Gyan Chaupar boards. The central body of the board is also an 8x9 grid, even though a few squares in the central column have been subdivided into several squares. And if you count the totality of squares, you'll end up on 84. Hamsa and the Punyapala and the Papapala in the top and right left corner are not really squares. I just put them here to indicate where they are on the drawing, but they're not individual squares. So there is, you can either see it sort of as a 72 square chart or an 84 square chart. And the whole chart is structured around the central column, which has this eightfold chakra system coming from Adhara up to the Brahmarandra along the central spine, which also includes here Kurma and Ananta, as you saw also on the drawing. And then you also see in the center Agni, this word that we couldn't really place on the Gyan Chaupar boards. And here in the English translation, as far as I recall, it reads gastric fire. Which I take to be the Agni, the digestive fire in the body. And apart from this organization of the central column, we also have these snakes that are linking squares, and they're always linking opposites. They're linking positives and negatives. Now, this is of course different from how the snakes work in the Snakes and Ladders game in Gyan Chaupar, but so there's no sort of inherent value whether the snakes are positive or negative, but clearly they're linking again pairs like dharm and adharm, durbuddhi, subbuddhi, and so on and so forth. And then we have this distinction between punya and papa in the top and right left corner, which are where the hands are illustrated on the chart. So if you see the chart from the direction of the figure on the chart, his right hand is punya and his left hand is papa. Then going further, we also find several terminological correspondences with Gyan Chaupar boards. First of all these terms, they're always grouped in groups of 2, 3, or 4 on the board. Again, a reminiscent of how terms are grouped on Gyan Chaupar boards. And we even find some terms that are identical to the Gyan Chaupar boards. For example, the 3 gunas, tamas, rajas, sattva. And we also have 3 of the mahabhutas down on the bottom, tejas, apvayu, fire, water, and wind. And in the top right corner, we have this sequence of salokya, samipya, sarupya, sayujya, these different stages of union with the divine, which is found not on the board that I showed you, but which is found also in this sequence and in the same place on the chart of a variety of Gyan Chaupar boards associated with Maharashtra, deriving from Maharashtra and associated with Gyaneshwar, the 13th century poet saint in Maharashtra. So the whole layout, the whole organization, the elements, all this is reminiscent of what we might expect really from a Gyan Chaupar board. But then again, clearly this is not a game board in the sense that Gyan Chaupar is a game board. And we don't know what this chart was actually used for, but there is definitely a chance that it went beyond the mere idea of illustration, that it was also used for visualization or meditation practices. And if this was indeed the case, it becomes interesting to ponder the idea whether a chart such as this, these sort of non-formalized ludic activity in the sense of visualizing a progress through the chart, meditating on specific squares in the chart, whether that could really be seen as something that was feeding into this formalized, gamified system of the same practice on a Gyan Chaupar board, that the Gyan Chaupar board might really gamify and formalize a system of visualization and meditation, and then somehow stand at the crossroads between a spiritual practice and a spiritual pastime. This at least is a hypothesis that I think is worth considering. And of course, we need more information about how were these early subtle body charts used, and how were the early Gyan Chaupar charts used. Because one of the sad things, of course, is that we don't really have any descriptions of people's experiences with playing Gyan Chaupar in the early days. People may have played it as a simple pastime, but there was certainly also a mode that you could play this game in that was different. And if we want to understand anything about that today, all we have to go on really is whatever living traditions remain. And coming here to sort of the final little section, if we look to India today and see what is really the living tradition of playing these games, we find that the game exists to a very limited extent. I mean, it has mostly been completely replaced by snakes and ladders, but it still exists to a limited extent. And you find it, for example, in the Jain communities, again, especially in Western India, though this is actually a chart from Madhya Pradesh, where it's used as a didactic tool for children. So it's not really considered a game for adults, which I believe it was earlier. But here, it's sort of as a symbol, a didactic tool where you will learn something about Jaina cosmology and some key Jain terminology, some saints, a bit of this and a bit of that. The Jain boards are completely different from the Vaishnava board in their contents. I don't have time to go into that now, but it's more clear that what you learn when you play the Jain game is you learn how the game universe is put together. You learn key terminology related to Jainism. So that's one mode of playing the game that we find today as a didactic mode. And then we also find in South India that we have these sort of very colorful illustrated charts that are played on special occasions. For example, during the Vaikundha Ekadashi in South India, these game boards around the time where that festival is will start appearing in temple shops, and you can buy them, and you're meant to sort of be playing them throughout the night. Stay awake and play this game, and it'll give you merit. But nothing other than that is really associated with them. People that I've interviewed, elderly people that I've interviewed that remembered doing this in their childhood, said they had absolutely no idea about really the content of the game. They were just playing it for fun and as a way to keep awake. So it was more sort of a ritual act that you were going through without any deeper recognized meaning behind it. And these are really the two main existing traditions of playing the game in India that seems to have roots in the past. In the West, however, the game was introduced in 1975 by Harish Johari, sort of a well-known Indian scholar and philosopher who published the game with a fold-out game board you can play on, and a book of commentary with a description of each individual square in the game, which gave the same sort of interpretation to the game boards, playing on sort of this micro and macro cosmic dichotomy. And again, you can see here the figure of a cross-legged yogic man sitting in the game board, and his head goes up to the square just beneath the topmost square of the board, and the chakras are placed in his body, and then there is sort of the cosmic consciousness, which is Johari's translation of Vaikunth, at the top of the board. So, and this was played in New Age communities from the 70s onwards, and the book has been translated into many languages, and it still exists to some limited degree in the West. You can still buy it here and there. And right now, the game is actually experiences a revival, especially for some reason in Russian-speaking communities. You'll find a number of websites which are offering courses in the game, which is selling the game. You can become a coach. You can train for months and learn how to play this game with others. There are group sessions being set up for these games. It's sort of become an instrument on the scene of alternative spirituality, for want of a better word. And it even happens that my own thesis has been translated into Russian in a sort of truncated fashion without footnotes or literary references or appendices or anything, but just, as a core of it, which is like an immense effort to translate this book and try to push it, and even believe that there is a market for this. But again, it just shows the vibrancy of this community that you find in the Russian-speaking parts of the world. And actually, this summer, I had my first session of really playing the game. I was playing it with a Belarusian instructor, and we played for 5 hours. And the game was focused on a single question that I asked of the game board. And then for those 5 hours while we were playing the game, landing on different squares and then exploring this question from different angles. So it was kind of a therapeutic experience with a coach going through it. And I must say it was a very powerful experience, and it really showed the potential of this game as a tool for self-exploration in a way that I'd probably considered it intellectually, but it was only really when playing it this summer that I fully understood how powerful this can be, and how powerful it might also have been 150 or 200 years ago when it first appeared in India. So the bottom line is that we don't know how this game was played in the past. And surely it was played differently than it is today in these new agey alternative religion settings. But I do feel, based on my experience, that the spirit of playing the game, the way of deep engagement with the game to learn something about the world, to divine something about your own future, or to help you in your life choices, that element is something that may really go all the way back to the original charts. So in a sense, even though Gyan Chaupar has long since been replaced by Snakes and Ladders in India, the spirit of playing it still lives on today, I believe. And I think I'll stop here. I've been talking for about an hour, so now it's probably a good time to stop and take some questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jacob. That was absolutely fascinating. I had loads of questions. Unfortunately, my laptop sort of died to death halfway through, and I had to switch onto my phone, so I can't see them in front of me. But yeah, I had, well, actually, one of them you answered at the end there, because I was wondering whether there was a commercial opportunity we could collaborate, the Centre for Yoga Studies and you and create a game board. And I mean, maybe we could do one that's sort of combined with Twister or something like that for all the yoga practitioners. No, but anyway, more seriously, sort of, first of all, I'm wondering where the term Chaupar, and also then you quoted Banabharta and Ashtapada. I mean, Chaupar I can kind of understand. Maybe it's from what would it be, 4 feet or putta or something, but I can't really understand why it'd be ashtapada for a chessboard in particular.
Well, the astapada is it means, I mean, a pada in the sense of also a square, so it's the 8 square board, so it's the board with 8 times 8 squares. You also
Right.
have the dashapata, it's a 10 by 10, and astapada, the earliest mention of that you find in the Buddhist Brahmajala Sutta from the early centuries of the Common Era, is where you first find that. Chaupered is a little more difficult to really explain. You have this chatusputta, the 4 folds. You have when you use it, when you make the soma in the Vedic ritual, you have these 4 stones that you put into sort of 4 pockets, and you use it somehow to I guess prepare the soma plant. And it's sometimes connected with that, but really I think that it's rather chatuspata in the sense of either 4 feet, or chatuspata in the sense of 4 cloth. That is really 4 pieces of cloth that is put together. And the earliest literary occurrence that we have of the word is in from Sufi romances from around 1500 is where it first appears. But there we learn that it's said that in Rajasthan, there's a chaupar board in every palace. So clearly it was already quite prevalent at that time, but that's the earliest occurrence we have really of the word. So Gyan Chaupar, of course, builds on that. So Chaupar here is really a stand-in for a game. Like if you read most early translations of text where there are references to games, they'll always talk about, they were playing on a drafts board, or they were playing on a chess board. And then when you look at the original wording, it's of course something completely different. But you just use any old game that people will know as sort of a placeholder for any game. So you have to be very careful, really, about these references, and that goes for all game literature. It's a sort of a common pitfall to just accept these early translations as references to existing games, as often just placeholders.
Okay, thanks. You're very interesting. I wonder also that, fascinating that you said that the Sufi romances, the Prema Kyans or Prem Kathas mentioned. I mean, it seems unlikely, but also they have these interesting allegories of the yogic journey. But I don't suppose that the Chaupar is mentioned in that context.
Well, the Chaupar is used as a metaphor. It's used partly to sort of reveal the true nature of persons. Like if you can play Chaupar well, it proves you're a prince, for example. So it's I mean, playing games is also part of the kalas, the skills that you have to master, in order to be a cultured person. So playing chess or Chaupar, and especially playing it 2 people, but controlling 2 sides of the board each, a sort of a premium mark of being a really good player. But it's also used as a love metaphor in the Sufi romances. And there is all this whole thing in Chaupar, for example. You can twin pawns. That is, if you have 2 of your own pawns in the same square, they form a pair and they move around. They become stronger, and that becomes then sort of a metaphor for sexual intercourse. And the pawns themselves often have this dome shape, which is often described as a breast shape, as the shape of the female breast. And the whole terminology that's associated with the different throws that you can make when you throw the dice. They often use stick dice with 4 sides, like long dice with 4 sides. And the different number combinations is then also given some interpretation that gives it this sort of erotic mode. There is especially in Padmavati, the romance from 1540, there's a long sequence of a Chaupar game that sort of slowly sort of slides into sort of a sexual intercourse using the same game metaphors.
Okay, wow, fascinating. And I got one last sort of comment question. I can't see the Slido, so I don't know if anyone else can get in there because I'm now on my phone. But I was particularly interested as well when you were talking about the 9 snakes corresponding and then being directly made parallel with the 9 channels in the body and the 72,000 quarters or 72 quarters, because I wasn't aware of parallels in Sanskrit text, but I had a quick look, and of course there are a few, and I think they rather support also your suggestion that the games originate in the north and the west of India, because it seems particularly texts from that region that have this system of 9. And you quoted from the Siddhisiddhanta Paddhati, I think, but I don't think, in fact, there's a verse in there as well which mentions the 9 rivers or 9. Yeah. So, and that text, I think, is certainly from Punjab or Kashmir, that kind of region. So I thought, yeah, that's quite a useful way of identifying where the games might have originated. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, if I can just comment on that, that accounts for the snakes. The latter symbolism is more difficult, but there is also in the Goraksha Shataka, there's a verse right in the beginning which talks about the Mukti Sopana, so the ladder to liberation. And if you go down to South India, you find the game being called Parampat Sopana, so the ladder to the highest place. So so this idea of Sopan is at least there in the terminology, though it's less clear. And on the Jain boards, for example, it's often not ladders but rather lines, and they seem to be more like of transmigratory lines, the shrinis that the souls they transmigrate along when they move between bodies. It's these little bits and pieces that we have to go on when we try to find out how did the charts really understand themselves, and where did they originate.
Okay, just one last question. I'll ask you to confirm something. So, as I understood it, you think that the games with these motifs are later than the text. That's the evidence you have at the moment. That they didn't sort of evolve in parallel. The crossovers seem so close and so interesting, but it'd be lovely to think that they were kind of in dialogue as they evolved, but perhaps that's
it's difficult to say, right? But it's the verses that you find on the charts that give some kind of interpretation of the game, but they're not found anywhere else. Nowhere. And I know of only a single booklet describing the game that appears to have sort of been used for playing the game, perhaps, which incorporates one of these verses. But Harish Johari, who republished the game in 1975, he writes in his introduction that there used to be a game of a book of shlokas that came along with the game. So each time you land on a square, you'd read a shlok. A little bit like when you're doing divination. You have this Pashika Kevali, these dice oracles, and when you throw a certain number, you read a little poem, and then you use that as the basis of your divination or your take on whatever it is that you're investigating when you're playing the game. So it's possible that some kind of booklets existed at one point with more information, but again, none of them have come down to us. And I also suspect, again, that it would be probably mostly sort of an oral tradition of people knowing about this terminology and being able to guide you through the game. I think it's quite likely that the game was played with some kind of guide. And we will often find it in royal settings, also in Rajasthan, for example, in the royal court in Jaipur, among other places.
Okay, great, thank you. Now I'm going to ask if perhaps Theo, if there's anything on the Slido we can go to, because I can't see it. I've managed to make my computer start, but I can't get on.
Well, at least it started. We have a couple of really good questions coming in, and if we run out, I have one. But let's go to Richard Williams, who actually has 2 questions, I think. I'm going to ask you to unmute, Richard.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Theo. Hi, Jakob. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Thanks for sharing this. I'll be quick. So one question was, can you say more about the Sufi boards, please? And in particular, what would the snakes and ladders themselves be associated with in Sufi cosmology? And secondly, I was interested that these boards you identified were sort of popping up in the late 18th century, and you had one example from Lucknow and so on. So do you think there's a possibility these boards were influenced by European games that were making their way over to India via colonialism? Thank you.
Yes, okay. Let me start with the last question first. The origin of games is really complicated. It's a complicated story because games rarely travel as a full package. Usually they're combined of different elements. So what I suspect is that the formal system that I showed you of how the game is made, how you have the sequence of squares, how you move along them with one pawn, you go up and down, all this. That this whole formal system did not exist in India prior to this game. It did, however, exist in Europe in what we know as the game of the goose, which is originally an Italian game from the 14th, first attested in the 14th century. And the earliest known boards of the game of the goose are actually from India. They were manufactured, commissioned to be manufactured in Gujarat in the 16th century. We have some very interesting, and those are the earliest Game of the Goose boards we have. So we know that the Game of the Goose was present in India, at least as something that was being commissioned. We can also see on the manufacture of the boards that whoever did them were not used to doing them. They're carved in wood, and the carvings are really off. So it's clearly not like standard measure to produce them. Though we do have at the Mughal court, under Aurangzeb in the late 17th century, we do have examples of Persianate Game of the Goose boards, where you basically have it's a talisman. So you enter this magical world and you travel around it, fighting dragons and finding treasure. And these games are called Ganj, treasure. And the treasure is then in the center of the board, and you have to acquire it. So we know that the Game of the Goose in this way was in India at the time, and I suspect that mechanically Snakes and Ladders or Gyan Chaupar are influenced by the Game of the Goose. On the other hand, thematically, games of spiritual progression, they have a long history in China, especially. We have these games going back to the early part of the second millennium in China, based on a model of games going back even further. And those are Buddhist games. So, and if you go to Nepal, you find a coexistence of versions of these Chinese games, now Tibetan games, and Gyan Chaupar. So thematically, there seems to be some kind of possible inspiration from Tibet and China, and game mechanically some inspiration from Europe. And then, of course, the fashioning of the board, which I've been talking about here in particular, is then what is really, I think, uniquely Indian. The way that the board is set up, the way it's inscribed, the way that you have this depiction of this micro and macrocosmic symbology placed onto the boards. I think that's the really Indian part of it. As for the Sufi charts, the Sufi charts are organized, not according to chakras, but according to the different heavens. So you move up through the different heavens, and they are usually 10 by 10. So more similar to modern Snakes and Ladders boards, and may also have inspired them, actually. And on the Sufi boards, you have, you don't necessarily have snakes and ladders, you often have snakes and arrows. Arrows is this thing with the Sufi boards. Sometimes you have chains and arrows. You have sort of different figurative elements. So the snakes and ladders were not really apparently like the big thing originally with the Sufi boards. And then you're moving up towards the throne of Allah. The largest snake on the Sufi board, the snake that'll take you the furthest back. On the Vaishnava board, it's Ahankar. If you reach there, you go all the way back to the second square, Maya. Whereas in the Sufi board, the longest snake going down is Shaitan. If you hit that, you fall down right down to the bottom of the game. And then you also have different angels on the Sufi boards, but it's very much the same in the sense of do's and don'ts, taboos, and that's written on it, and then with sort of a sprinkling of Sufi terminology. But the Sufi boards appear to have been adapted in the early 19th century in these Sufi environments, and some of them are very elaborate. Like beautifully wood-carved board inlaid with mother of pearl and everything. So they were really, I think, considered like beautiful art objects. And they traveled westwards, and you also find a whole derivation of them in the Ottoman Empire and also even down in Syria. So they have an outlier in that direction.
Great, thank you for that, Jacob. I think we've got time for one or two more. There are a couple of questions that are kind of more technical. So someone's asking for the kind of a reference for the Vaishnava game in the British Library. And someone else is giving details of the game being played in Brazil. And what I'm going to suggest is if those people send those questions and comments to us at CYS, then we can forward them to you and to your email and put you in contact, because that'd be really nice, I think. But in the meantime, I think Ruth has a question.
Hiya, thanks ever so much for that presentation. I adored the illustrations and how fascinating. I just had a quick question about the snakes as good or bad, and Kundalini as sort of going up the center. As far as I could tell, she wasn't represented as doing that, so you just had the sort of multiple negative oriented snakes. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about that. Thank you.
So, sorry, can you repeat it again? I didn't quite understand.
I think in your presentation, you talked about benign snakes as well
Yes.
as negative snakes, and you talked about the 8 coils of Kundalini, which I haven't actually seen many people talk about that much. So I find that really interesting that you're saying that the serpentine movement upwards could, and that the 8 coils are somehow important to that. So yeah, I'm really interested in how the snakes are being represented both in negative and in benign ways.
Right. So it's primarily a feature on Nepalese game charts that you have benign snakes, and the benign snakes, they are they're turned upside down. So the head of the snake is at the bottom, and when you land on it, you slide upwards to the tail, which is then at the top. So they're like inverted snakes, and they're usually painted in orange colors, and then usually the snake leading from Bhakti to Vaikunth is a white snake with multiple heads representing Shesha, the snake of Vishnu. And with regards to this, the idea that the 8 rows of the game board might somehow have to do with the 8 coils of Kundalini, I mean, that's really pure speculation on my side. It's not attested anywhere, and I think what often happens with games, there is this whole discussion, like, are games abstract or are they representational? And the representational part of it is something that you can project onto a game board. I mean, game boards are inherently don't have any inherent meaning. They're just formal systems, naked formal systems, and then you can apply different kind of interpretive strategies to them that can make them become something else, and that is what is happening. So I think it would be the way that we talking about the game board and the way it's interpreted is also, I think, a living thing. I mean, if somebody suddenly it dawns on him that, oh, there are 8 rows, Kundalini has 8 coils, you know, that can become part of the metaphor. It doesn't mean necessarily that the game was designed with that in mind. But what's interesting to me is when I look at these diagrammatic subtle body chart that I showed you, and also other diagrammatic mandalas and yantras, that, I mean, the way of representing the different divinities and these different kotas in the diagram is very evocative of snakes and ladders. And the Kundalini on the subtle body chart is also sometimes drawn as a coiled serpent, or it's as a you also sometimes have nadis on these diagrams as serpents sort of intertwining up around the chakras up to the central spine of the body. There's even a game board in the City Palace Library in Jaipur, which shows really, it's the only game board that has the chakras inscribed on it and also have the snakes coiling around them. So yeah, so the whole snake metaphor and the association with nadis, it's very much a sliding thing, because sometimes it'll be even on game boards that only have lines for snakes that are not really figuratively snakes at all. You'll have a verse identifying the snakes as nadis, even though there are no snakes on the boards. So it seems quite clear that is how they're interpreted. But again, you know, what came first? We don't know. but it just seems that these games are so special. They're difficult to make. They're inscribed. You cannot just draw them on the ground and play them. So it seems to be objects that was really created, invented by someone and then spread. It just is not like other games which are just naturally evolving as variations over other games. This seems to be sort of a concerted effort to create these games based on some kind of platform or diagram, which I then hypothesize may have something to do with these subtle body charts and other similar diagrammatic forms.
Fantastic. I'm aware of the time. Jim, did you have anything to add, or shall we wrap up? We're happy.
I can wrap up. I've had lots more questions. No, I better wrap.
I know, me too.
We've had Jacob for too long. I wanted to actually just a very tiny question with the cowries. What is it, a 50-50 chance of them landing up or down?
No, it's about a 45-55.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought that. Yes, great. I've got loads of other, but another hope person sometime.
Yeah, same. I want to know about the distribution. The thing I want to talk about is the distribution of where the game is found in the contemporary world. So the fact that it's more Russian and where you find it and where you don't. But yes, again, we would be here all day, I think, if I talk about that. So we'll move that to email, Jacob.
Sure.
Thank you for a fantastic talk.